The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below. Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss. Welcome to the second part of an ongoing study of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. In the first installment, I looked over the instrumentation of the piece, commenting on how Stravinsky's choice of instruments helped to create unique orchestral colors and textures. Now let's hear the perspective of a conductor in preparation for an upcoming performance of this piece. Maestro Mark Today is currently the conductor of both Orchestra Wellington here in New Zealand and the Vallejo Symphony Orchestra in California. He's very well traveled as a guest conductor with recent performances across Asia, North America, and Australia. One of my favorite examples of Mark's conducting was his recording of Douglas Pipe's sprawling, phantasmagorical score to the comedy horror Christmas film Krampus a couple of years ago. He's also known for his daring, imaginative season programming. This year, he's conducting the most notable works that resulted from Ballet Russe impresario Diaghilev's collaborations with the great composers of the early 20th century, including Ravel, Debussy, and of course, the three foundational ballets of Stravinsky, Firebird, Petrushka, and the Rite of Spring. Mark joined me a couple of weeks ago in my studio for a chat about the upcoming season finale and his outlook on the music of Stravinsky's breakout period in Paris. Today we've got Mark with us, Mark Today, and he's the conductor of Orchestra Wellington. And they are about to perform Jeux tomorrow night, but planning for a long-term season of works that include the commissions from Diaghilev for most of his significant works, of which Jeux is one. And of course, the one that everybody remembers, the scandalous, shocking, riotous premiere of The Rite of Spring from 1913. And Mark is going to be performing that in about 2 months?
No, in December.
December, okay.
Yeah, it's our final performance.
Okay. Great. Well, that really is kind of the ultimate. You really couldn't do that first, right?
No, that's right. Yeah. So we began with the Firebird. We finish with the Rite. And it seemed like the right thing to do.
We've got Mark here to get the conductor's perspective on everything from preparing for the work to having an insight into the work and its context, which, of course, is, this whole season being about Diaghilev. The context is very important.
Absolutely.
So you were telling me while we were sort of warming up to really start the interview about how you felt Jeux was actually a more complex work to perform.
Well, I think so. For me, the Rite of Spring follows on very clearly from Firebird and Petrushka, and also then you look towards Les Noces and some of his other works, Song of the Nightingale, in that they're very, very influenced by Russian folk music. Very clearly so. What isn't Russian folk music still sounds like it in his music. And there are pieces, just like there are tunes in the Firebird and Petrushka, there are tunes from the Rite of Spring that are also taken verbatim. And in a way, it's this kind of modernist approach of claiming a folk idiom and transforming it into something revolutionary. For me, Jeux is coming from a much more impressionistic plan. And it's certainly very much a product of the modernist period for me, but what I find fascinating about Jeux is how it absolutely is a harbinger of the postmodern era, in terms of the way that it is constantly in flux. It is constantly changing, whereas the Rite of Spring is very, very segmented. There are set pieces in the Rite of Spring, and just before we began this, you were telling me something that I did not know, that the Adoration of the Earth, the introduction, was the last thing that he wrote. And I think we both agreed also that, in a way, it is the most sophisticated example of orchestration in the entire work.
I would tend to agree, and what's cool about it is that there are almost no strings whatsoever,
exactly,
or percussion. Right. Just a couple touches of brass here and there, but it's really just a woodwind manifesto.
Absolutely. That's right. In fact, you have the seconds and the violas coming in maybe a minute or 2 minutes into it, just playing pizzicati, really.
Right.
Oh, it's fabulous.
Well, my feeling about this is that it really says something about Stravinsky coming to Paris, writing the Firebird, which would be a piece that he felt he could have made the kinds of demands of Firebird on a Russian orchestra, which he was experienced with, and seeing that the Parisians could do it.
Mm-hmm.
And then piling on for Petrushka, it's like, oh God, you guys can play that? Well, try this. And then they were able to play it, and so it was like, okay, let's raise the bar again. Exactly. And I feel that that is just the ultimate for what you could expect from musicians in terms of coordination, intonation, and also having this wild, colorful swash of sound. I mean, I agree with you about Jeu being a more complex work to prepare and perform, but I think in terms of like relationships between instruments and the naked exposure of the soloists and featured lines, I'd say that probably in that way it might be harder.
That's right. And I didn't mean to be dismissive. And when I say more complicated, perhaps I'm just talking about the complication of subtlety, right, which I think is very clearly in something that Jeu is about.
Right.
Similar size orchestra, not quintuple winds, quadruple, and obviously we don't have the tam-tams, what have you, in Jeu,
right,
but it's a mammoth-sized orchestra, and yet he doesn't use the orchestra to massive effect. It's all very, very lightly scored ultimately.
So this series is really targeted at a pretty wide audience. There are people who are just starting to orchestrate and are yet very passionate about Stravinsky. They want to learn more about the Rite of Spring. And then there are people who are probably professional composers, and they also kind of want to know the perspective of other professionals. So I think it would be interesting to know how you prepare for a work like this, just because that context could also apply to a composer who has another piece of work that they're working on with a conductor soon themselves. Maybe the steps that you go through, and also thinking ahead for you with your particular orchestra and knowing the strengths of your players.
Mm-hmm. That's a really tough question to ask. I mean, the Rite of Spring, because the Rite is a ballet, it doesn't have a kind of established sonata form structure that is the bread and butter of any conductor, really. I mean, so for instance, when I started with the Firebird, I paired it with another work by a similar aged composer 100 years before, Beethoven, his first symphony, and then thinking this is a young genius announcing their presence to the world. And then the last concert, the Eroica, with the Rite. I see these two pieces as monuments, sort of their line in the sand, pieces that change the world of music forever. The commonality between all four of these pieces, or two and two, is the fact that the Beethovens are very clearly part of the common practice in terms of how does one structure the whole harmonic tension between dominant and tonic, and sonata form does it really, really well. So from my point of view, in terms of learning one of those scores, it's a sense of going through harmonically, working out how the composer is working these long-range structures, and then making the structures smaller and smaller, finally filling in the orchestration. Where do I point the baton at a certain stage, what have you. With Firebird, with the Rite, because it's very much at the service of the choreographer, they're more set pieces. What is magnificent about the Rite of Spring is, whilst there are set pieces, Adoration of the Earth, what have you, Sacrificial Dance, ultimately the entire piece is derived from these small motifs that he layers and expands upon. And almost without exception, that is how the work is constructed. So it's a little bit more difficult to study from my point of view in that regard. So the way that I approach this is to go one dance at a time. Right. Work out what are the particularities of the structure and also what are the particularities of the orchestration. So, I mean, it could be that I decide, this is a few months in the future, well, how am I going to structure my rehearsal? Maybe I'll do this dance and then this dance, and we can say to the brass, so you don't have to be here for the first half hour of rehearsal. It's just being collegial to these people. They can spend more time in the pub or what have you, reading the paper.
Right.
So there's that kind of thing. But one of the glories of the Rite of Spring is that the dances are all so very, very different. And before we began this, I just said, well, it's difficult for me to really enthuse about the magic of the orchestration of this work, or at least to point out what are the highlights, because you turn the page and there's yet another highlight.
Right.
It is just a spectacular work.
I love how he will be just chugging along, and there will be a huge full page of orchestration, and you expect that he's going to resolve or sort of bring the energy down in a few bars afterwards, but no, that's it. You just turn the page and there's nobody. There's like a oboe or something.
Absolutely.
Yeah, he doesn't have to resolve. He just goes there. And, you know, I feel that the precedent was really set by certain passages of Rimsky-Korsakov,
Of course.
Stravinsky himself, and of course Debussy. I was actually listening to La Mer and thinking, you know, well, he's never going to resolve anything. All the way through, you know, there are no cadences in this piece, or what we would understand as a traditional cadence.
Right.
And I think that just gave everybody permission to just stop when the music needed to stop, to bring passage to an end violently, you know, just a violent chop.
Yes.
Almost like he sort of ran out of staff paper and he just had to scribble the rest on a napkin.
Yeah. But I think also the original function of the music also works towards that aim as well. And, you know, if you look at the first early atonal works, these composers were cast adrift, structurally speaking, so they started relying on songs and amusical aspects like poems, poetry, what have you, to set. And that gave a sense of how the music would progress. And I think there's a little bit of that in some of these ballet scores. What's glorious for me about the Rite of Spring is the fact that it's a better concert piece than it is a ballet, ultimately. More famous.
Yeah, that's what Stravinsky felt ultimately, that it was better. My feeling about that, and this is something I'm going to talk about in a couple of segments with these lessons, is that if you are dancing it, and you are part of that corps, and you are just thrashing around on stage to Nijinsky's choreography, then you are feeling the full effect of the choreography.
Yes.
But I think if you are not dancing it, it just doesn't look very big. It doesn't look like a whole lot is happening, especially if you are watching it from afar, and you're seeing one or two people dance. They could be dancing violently, but the scope of the music is just so enormous, is just so world-shaking, that just to see one or two people kind of move around doesn't quite, you know, you almost expect to see massive throngs of people moving to some of these textures.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly perceptive observation, actually.
Thank you.
There is this aspect of, well, I'm not a dancer, but when I used to be a player, what you're feeling would have a huge influence on what you think would be coming out of your instrument sometimes. It's difficult to divorce these things. And look, we can't really know how great Nijinsky was.
Right.
He must have been a force of nature. Everyone said he was an extraordinary dancer. And to watch the Joffrey Ballet's recreation, and I just watched a recreation of his choreography for Jeu, they're interesting. I think his choreography for the Rite works pretty well.
Yeah.
Jeu, I think the music is incomparably more sophisticated than the choreography.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I mean, I think that, of course, like Nijinsky was dancing it himself.
That's right. And I would see. I'd love to know what he looked like in Jeu.
Yeah.
But then, you know, he's an extraordinarily important dancer and also choreographer. But it's more for a work that he commandeered, which of course is the Prelude to the F minor Faun.
As you can tell, Mark and I are just getting warmed up here. Please join us on Patreon for the full 25-minute interview, with insights into conducting tricky rhythms, balancing sections, rehearsing using the structure of the piece, and Mark's favorite parts to conduct. For our regular viewers here on YouTube, though, here's the beginning of the score analysis from the next section of the Rite of Spring, the Augurs of Spring and the Dances of the Young Girls. And now we're back to our scoring analysis, with the second part of Part 1, the Augurs of Spring and Dances of the Young Girls. Now, at the end of the last lesson, I might have said something about how I was going to revisit this section leading into the second part. And I think that's only fair. Let's talk a little bit about the harmony that's being set up here, because if we talk about it now, then you can explore it on your own and kind of go farther on your own. As I pointed out before, the bassoon solo is coming in a half step lower and basically playing everything identical to what it was before, only, you know, in, I guess, C flat major, or if you want to think about it that way. And, right, so that leaves us right at the end there of that bassoon solo with D natural sounding B flat, right? Now, if you just look at the bare harmony here, with the violins picking up the pizzicato here, it would seem to be a normal kind of transition. Just very, very easygoing harmony, except for the fact that the clarinet is trilling up to concert D natural, C and D. Yeah, it does not quite sound the same. And then jumping ahead here, we have this beautiful chord made up of 6 solo violas, right? This is just really, really breaking down to, almost the atomic level on some of these textures. And, this is something that Stravinsky liked to do a lot, and actually Ravel and Debussy as well, and that is to isolate a few solo instruments from one of the string families and then just highlight it. And, this, I think Ravel did it in Daphnis and Chloe a lot, and of course La Mer has its famous passage with solo cellos, and actually Rossini did that as well. Had a whole section of cellos solely playing different functions in the William Tell Overture. But here we've got our 6 solo violas, and they just have this really wonderful sound, especially when they're topped by this D natural harmonic. And which I think you could just get on the D string playing right here, just touching the note of the 4th, and then you get this lovely little note way up here. Okay, but what is that chord? Essentially, when you try to sort of stack it up in a nice way, it basically sounds like a C dominant 9 flat 5. Right, so here's our C dominant 9, and then just our flat 5 there. Okay, but the F sharp, or it's spelled as F sharp, the G flat is stuck on the bottom, along with the B flat, and then we've got our mediate of E, and then we've got B natural posing as a C, and then we've got our G fifth on the top, right? So quite a unique voicing of this particular chord, and that is actually resolving to, right? So if you've got your weird C dominant 9 chord resolving to, that would be sort of Wagnerian, but of course in the bass is an F flat, right? So we've got our polychord stuff happening here, and that is just going to be hitting us right here with these chords, which is exactly what I was talking about. But notice how this is dovetailing, right into just an eighth note's worth of sound going right into the clarinets, which are playing the same basic chord, right? And the horns. Now, the horns give it away a little bit and make it less than a perfect dovetailing, and they're actually marked up a dynamic value from the clarinet. So I think he wants you to feel almost as if the violas are turning into these clarinets, and of course topped by that sopranino D clarinet on top. That just really gives the wonderful feeling of this G here, spelled as F, right? Because this is in D. Okay, it just really gives that wonderful feeling that this is carrying through that kind of hollow, luminous quality. But of course, this little guy down here is going to make it feel kind of almost coarse, and is going to turn up the suspense, right? And then we've got our, just continuing on, a little mezzo forte deal right there. And here is where the riot starts. This is probably what provoked the audience the most. in our famous Riot at the Rite, which, by the way, is a little exaggerated, and I'll be talking about that in a whole introductory section when we get towards the end of this series of courses. But for now, let's just take a look at what's going on here. We've got all altalone bowing, just hammering away at these all down bows. That's, just a row of down bow markings, and sempre staccato, sempre simile, so it's all the same, even with the accents. It's all just this bashing away, just very, very savage. It has such a huge sound, which we'll hear when I play this in a few minutes. Then, of course, the horns to back that up, just barking away. And, no fancy tricks here. This is just a plain old horn sound. Now, notice that this is in old notation. So what you're hearing is actually up a perfect fourth rather than down a perfect fifth, right? So everything that you read in transposed treble clef for horn is always, if it's horns in F, then it is always read as if C were F, right? Which is down a fifth. But you would also think C being F up a fourth, right? And that is what a lot of composers did up to the beginning of the 20th century. So this is old notation. New notation would actually have this written an octave higher, which is a lot more in line with what we're seeing here. This is just a perfect realization of the chords that are happening here. So it's really an intense sound, and what's really great about it is that the breath of the horn players and the stroke of these down bows is enough of a percussive effect for Stravinsky. He does not actually need any percussion, and that was one of the things that I was really surprised as a teenager when I studied the score and looked at it for the first time. I was just fascinated with the fact that there was no percussion written here. I swore to myself that I could maybe hear snare drum or maybe a tenor drum or some other kind of thing just going pow, pow on these little hits. But no, it is nothing but just a biting accent on horn, sforzando sempre, so always that attack, right? And this is just exactly a lesson in what a horn player is going to think. If you write sforzando under their parts, sforzando and staccato, they're going to bite it. Just as if it were, the conductor's baton getting a little too close. They're going to just bite it off. Pow, pow, right? Okay, now there's something about this particular rhythm here, and that is, if you listen to it, it will appear to you as if this is the downbeat and that is the offbeat, right? If you're not looking at the score, if you're just listening to it in your head, this is where the offbeat is. And this is going to happen more and more in this score, where the second part of the beat, or the and, is going to feel like the downbeat, and then the downbeats are going to feel like offbeats. It's just a wonderful, wonderful effect. But it can be very confusing if you're not an experienced score reader or not an experienced musician. Now, after that effect, he's got this really, really cool section in here. It's almost like the musicians are trading off in a ceremonial way, right? So you've got your big processional punch right here with almost like the armed guards of your pagan encampment are they're trotting in there and laying the ground and just sort of making sure that everybody behaves. And then here it sort of comes the more wiggly, people just sort of dancing through. And you've got the same little thing, dun 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 dun, that was being played by pizzicato strings beforehand, played on English horn. Now remember that this is transposing exactly like horn, so it sounds down a fifth, and that is the same exact pitches as this, correct? Correct. D flat becomes A flat, and so on. F, B flat becomes F, and so on. Now here we've got the bassoons and pizzicato cellos just sort of dancing up and down across this, and of course in different rhythmic values and in different patterns. And it just has this really wonderful syncopated feeling, even though nobody is really syncopating. But if you listen to where all of the harmony lines up, it just has this wonderful feeling, even though, you would think that this would just be a lot of collisions. But because the sounds are so different, the scoring can be very clear here, right? And then back to the same thing. Now, let's take a little break for a second and listen to all of this before it goes out of your head. Once again, things to listen for are, like I was just saying, the sort of semi-syncopated feeling of this section, even though everybody is playing because of the way the harmony lines up. The way that this sounds very, very percussive, almost as if a percussion instrument or percussion ensemble were joining in. And then, of course, the way this beautiful chord resolves into the polychord with the F flat at the bottom and is taken over somewhat by the clarinets, but also, the effect of complete and total dovetailing is somewhat betrayed by the sound of the muted horns. All right, let's listen to all of that and then go back into the rest of this part as it develops. Once again, at this point, I have to break off my public analysis before the music starts, as I only have permission to share it privately for now. But please consider lending your support to the Orchestration Online channel on Patreon, where you can view the rest of this analysis, along with the full analysis of the introduction from Part 1 of the Rite of Spring. I also offer many other perks to my supporters, like score analysis, video extras, and starting this month, weekly tips from my upcoming book, 100 More Orchestration Tips. If this all sounds like it's worth the cost of a couple fidget spinners, then I'd be honored by your support. See you soon for Lesson 3.